For my final project, I decided to talk about the 4 different types of racism. I'm going to be talking about what is racism, institutional racism, interpersonal racism, structural racism, and internalized racism. So what is racism? The definition of racism is prejudice or discrimination by an individual, community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is marginalized. So the first one is institutionalized racism. I have a short video that goes over it.
Hi, I'm Riley Dives. I'm 11 years old. A lot of grown-ups think that opportunities exist for all kids and all we need to do is apply ourselves. But I know that's just not true. It shouldn't matter if you live in the city or suburbs, on a farm or a reservation, or what your zip code may be, but it does. There's still rules to keep our schools separate and unequal. Why? We spend a lot of time talking about whether what someone says or does is racist, but that's not enough. You not liking me for the color of my skin is not the only thing that can affect my chances for success. I'm talking about the built-in barriers that keep me and other kids from reaching our full potential. It's all around us. We might not recognize it, even when it's right under our noses. Remember that time I had to start a campaign just to get books in my library about kids who look like me? Do you care enough to look closer, to talk to each other, to your students, to your communities? We've got to change the dialogue. So when we do, you'll be amazed by all we can accomplish. I'm looking at you.
Institutionalized racism is the policies and practices that exist throughout the whole society or organization and that result in and support a continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on race. Institutional racism was baked into the U.S. Constitution dating back to when the Founding Fathers were determining how to calculate the amount of seats each state would have in the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution states, shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, 3/5 of all other persons. Those 3/5 persons were slaves. Some historical background on institutionalized racism is the Social Security Act of 1935 because it excluded architectural workers and servants, positions primarily held by African Americans. The Wagner Act of 1935 because it did not allow Blacks to join protected labor unions. The National Housing Act of 1939 tied the property value appraisal and access to government loans to race. In the Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Some modern day examples are when minorities don't have access to proper medical care, when they cannot qualify for home mortgages under bank lending policies, when they are forced to live in poor communities with excessive crime, when they are arrested at higher rates and put in prison more often than others, when they do not get quality education because the schools in their neighborhoods are underfunded or in disrepair. The second one is interpersonal racism. Interpersonal racism is racism that occurs between individuals. Examples of this include hate crimes, an act of job or housing discrimination, negative racial comments about people of color, racial profiling or violence by a police officer towards a person of color. Number 3 is structural racism, and I also have a short video that goes over this.
What is structural racism? Structural racism is a system that gives white people advantages over Black, Indigenous, and people of color, like better access to education, wealth, and healthcare. It's what happens when society makes it normal for white people to have these advantages. It is the deepest and most common form of racism. All other kinds of racism stem from structural racism. Did you know white men live longer than Black and Indigenous men? That's because Black and Indigenous communities usually have less stable housing, poor access to health care, and stress that comes from experiencing racism every day. All of these factors exist because of structural racism.
Structural racism is racism totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. These patterns and practices in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, values, and distribution of resources, according to Zinzi Bailey. It refers to wider political and social disadvantages in society, such as higher rates of poverty for Black and Pakistani groups or higher rates of death from COVID-19 among people of color. Structural racism shapes and affects the lives, well-being, and life chances of people of color. It normalizes historical, cultural, and institutional practices that benefit white people and disadvantage people of color. It also stealthily replicates the racial hierarchy established more than 400 years ago through slavery, colonialism, placing white people at the top and Black people at the bottom. The fourth one is internalized racism. Internalized racism is personal beliefs and biases about race and racism that reside inside our minds, societal messages that produce and perpetuate internal privilege and oppression. Some examples of this include prejudice towards others of a different race, internalized oppression, which means the negative beliefs about oneself by people of color, internalized privilege, which means beliefs about superiority or entitlement by white people. So, conclusion, I'm just going to go over all of them one more time. Institutional racism is policies, practices, procedures and culture of institution or systems that work better for white people and cause harm to people of color, often inadvertently or unintentionally. Interpersonal racism is prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by a white individual toward a person of color. Structural racism is the history, culture, and current reality of racism across institutions and or systems when the institutional racism of multiple institutions overlaps to form a web of racism impacting people and communities of color. And the last one is internalized racism, the internalization of the racist stereotypes, values, images, and ideologies perpetuated by the white dominant society about one's racial group. And then I have a picture that goes along with it. And then here are my sources.